Capital punishment. This is something that has been a part of culture for pretty much as long as culture has existed. And today, at least in the United States, the topic of the death penalty is something that is hotly debated. And it's pretty much an even split too, right down America. We have 27 states out of 50 that utilize the death penalty and 23 states outlawing it. Fun fact, if you were to ask which state has the most executions per capita, you might be tempted to say something like Texas. And they do kill a lot of people in Texas. But Texas is also a huge state with a big population. The state which actually executes the most people per capita is Oklahoma. But I ask you, what would Jesus say about capital punishment? You might think he would have strong feelings about it since he himself was the subject of a very public execution. But there are several Bible verses which actually prescribe public execution as a form of punishment. So is the death penalty biblical? Is it justified today? Where should we as Christians fall in the execution debate? And what does the Bible have to say? Let's take a look.
Attention, bargain shoppers.
So capital punishment, the death penalty. It's interesting because it seems like in America, the more religious states tend to be more pro-death penalty. I mean, if you can call a state religious. But these Bible Belt states tend to be more pro-death penalty. In fact, I saw a statistic that 71% of white evangelical Christians support the death penalty. And it gets even more interesting when you look at the global community as a whole. More than 70% of the world's population has abolished the death penalty. So compared to the rest of the world, America seems to be very much pro the death penalty, and it's specifically supported by American Christians, at least in certain groups. Okay, Adam, well that is well and good, but what does the Bible actually say? Well, there are a number of verses in the Old Testament Levitical law which support the death penalty, public execution. We've got Leviticus chapter 24 verses 15 through 17, which tells us, anyone who curses their God will be held responsible. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. The entire assembly must stone them, whether foreigner or native born. When they blaspheme the name, they are to be put to death. And this verse is interesting specifically when you read kind of between the lines a little bit. It says whether foreigner or native born, so there's no favoritism there. It's just blasphemy is blasphemy. But then we also have verses like Exodus 22:19, which read, anyone who has sexual relations with an animal is to be put to death. Or Exodus 21:16, which says, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. So these are not really the most uplifting Bible verses you'll ever read. If you're teaching Sunday school, probably best not to lead off with these passages. So there are a couple things to keep in mind when approaching these scriptures. First of all, it's very tempting to kind of take these passages out of their original context and sort of port them over to today's worldview. But we'd be missing some key details. First, there are very specific circumstances in which the death penalty is to be exercised. You couldn't be just suspicious of your neighbor, drag them out into the street, and begin stoning them. There has to be a testimony of 2 to 3 witnesses minimum. We're told in Deuteronomy 17:6, on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a person is to be put to death, but no one is to be put to death on the testimony of only 1 witness. And then we're told in the next verse that when it's actually carried out, the witness is supposed to do this first, followed by the entire community. We see in Deuteronomy 17:7, the hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting that person to death, and then the hands of all the people. This was never meant to be something carried out in secret in some back alley, or some power that was meant to be in the hands of a small group of people who could be corrupted or subject to unjust influence. This was something meant to be carried out by the community, where each individual person or member of the community was meant to take responsibility for that judgment in carrying out that punishment. Subsequently, this was something that was only done rarely. It was an extreme measure. And additionally, it was something during that time and afterwards that God always met with grace. We see this as early as Genesis 4 when Cain kills Abel. And instead of putting him to death, God allows him to be exiled. We see this in verse 14. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth. We see God's grace all over the place, from when he was going to kill Moses before Zipporah intervened, to when God spares David's life after he commits adultery and kills Uriah. And finally, we see Jesus himself addressing this punishment in John chapter 8. Here, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman to Jesus who was caught in adultery. They bring her to Jesus and then remind Jesus of the law of Moses and basically say, what should we do with her? And they're trying to catch him in a little bit of a trap here. See, Jesus himself has been teaching that whoever loves God will obey God. So in the mind of the Pharisees, at least, to not stone this woman would be disobeying God. And if Christ didn't stone her, he would be in disobedience to God, which would be a sin. And this is where Jesus famously says in John 8:7, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first one to throw a stone at her." You see, if you actually go by the law of Deuteronomy 17:6, you need to have the testimony of at least 2 to 3 witnesses. And those witnesses would need to be present and be the first ones to throw the stone to actively participate in the punishment. So these Pharisees were far from both the spirit and the letter of God's law. But then Jesus tells her in John 8:11, "Neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." So Jesus doesn't say here that capital punishment in the Old Testament law is wrong, but he does stress the original spirit of the law and how God meant it. So if you were to take that and apply it today, we kind of have one judge or maybe a jury of 12 people doing the sentencing, and then it's carried out by a completely different department within the justice system. This is much different than the law, how God intended it to be. Those specific rules were meant to be for a specific people living under them in that time. So you can ask the question, does the fact that our society is structured differently today mean that we need to interpret and apply the Old Testament law differently? I think that's a valid question. So at the end of the day, it is really easy to take cut and dry arguments and kind of paste them over the questions about the death penalty and executions. I do very much question taking verses out of context and trying to apply them in a way today that doesn't really honor the spirit of what God was intending. But when we look at God and Jesus specifically carrying the will of the Father forward, there is always a bend towards mercy and grace, towards transparency, and towards forgiveness. So there's some thoughts. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, please feel free to like and subscribe. It does help out the channel. I'll leave the verses used today in the description below. Also, feel free to leave a comment. That helps as well. My name is Adam. This is Bargain Bin Theology, and remember, you get what you pay for.